In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd in southeastern Turkey was moving his sheep across a limestone ridge when he noticed something strange sticking out of the ground. Not a rock, not a root, carved stone. He reported it. Archaeologists arrived, and what they eventually uncovered beneath that hill completely rewrote the timeline of human religion. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. It's a complex of massive carved stone pillars arranged in circles, decorated with animals, abstract symbols, and figures that clearly meant something to the people who built them. It is the oldest known monumental religious structure ever found, and it was built roughly 12,000 years ago, before pottery, before writing, before agriculture, before any of the things we normally associate with civilization complex enough to produce organized religion. A group of hunter-gatherers, people we tend to imagine as purely focused on survival, apparently stopped everything they were doing and built a temple, which forces the question that archaeology alone cannot answer. Was Göbekli Tepe the beginning of human belief? Or was it just the first time belief left something solid enough to survive? Here's the problem with studying the origins of religion. Belief doesn't fossilize. You can find a bone, you can find a tool, you can find ash from a fire that burned 1,000,000 years ago, but you cannot dig up a thought. You cannot carbon date a feeling of awe. Everything we know about the earliest stirrings of human spirituality comes from indirect evidence, from what people buried, what they painted, what they built, and what they chose to do with their dead. And that evidence, when you actually look at it closely, pushes the origins of something like religious behavior much further back than most people expect. Let's start with the dead. The way a species treats its dead tells you something profound about how it thinks. Most animals don't bury their dead at all. They leave them, move on, survive. But Neanderthals, a separate human species that lived alongside early Homo sapiens and went extinct roughly 40,000 years ago, appear to have deliberately buried their dead. At a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found Neanderthal remains positioned carefully in the earth, with evidence suggesting flowers may have been placed in the grave. The flower evidence is debated, but the intentional positioning of the body is not. These were not creatures who simply discarded their dead. They did something deliberate, something that implies, at minimum, an awareness that death was significant. Whether that awareness included anything like a concept of an afterlife, nobody can say. But the behavior itself is there, in the ground, 60,000 years old. Homo sapiens, our own species, pushed this further, much further. Around 100,000 years ago, at a site called Skull Cave in Israel, anatomically modern humans were buried with red ochre, a pigment made from iron oxide that appears repeatedly across prehistoric sites worldwide in contexts associated with ritual. Ochre has no practical survival value. It doesn't make you warmer. It doesn't feed you. Its repeated appearance in burial contexts strongly suggests it carried symbolic meaning, that these people believed something about death that required a response beyond simply disposing of the body. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. The use of ochre as a symbolic pigment in Africa goes back not 100,000 years, but at least 300,000 years. Some sites suggest even earlier, meaning the capacity for symbolic thought, the mental ability that underlies all religious behavior, may have existed in our ancestors long before anything we'd recognize as organized belief. The hardware was there. The software was being written slowly, over an almost incomprehensible span of time. Cave art tells a similar story. The painted caves of Europe, Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, date back 30,000 to 40,000 years. They contain animals, handprints, and figures that researchers have interpreted as shamanic, as records of altered states of consciousness, as early attempts to communicate with forces beyond the ordinary. But painted ochre marks in South African caves push symbolic visual expression back to at least 75,000 years ago. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, a carved ivory figurine depicting a half-human, half-lion creature, dates to around 40,000 years ago. It is the oldest known depiction of something that doesn't exist in nature. Someone imagined a world beyond what they could see, and then they carved it. So when did humans first believe in something? The honest answer is we don't know, and we probably never will, with any precision. What we can say is that the behaviors associated with belief, symbolic thought, ritual treatment of the dead, art depicting the impossible, structures built for purposes beyond pure survival, appear in the archaeological record progressively earlier the more carefully we look. The question may not be when belief appeared, but when it became complex enough to leave marks we can still find. What we do know is that Göbekli Tepe didn't come from nowhere. The people who built it weren't inventing religion from scratch. They were the inheritors of tens of thousands of years of accumulated symbolic thinking, ritual behavior, and the very human tendency to look at a world full of things they couldn't explain and reach for an explanation that went beyond the visible. The thunder had to come from somewhere. The animals had to be asked permission before the hunt. The dead had to go somewhere. These aren't primitive mistakes. They are the first attempts at the same project that philosophy, science, and theology are still working on today. The shepherd who found Göbekli Tepe was moving his sheep across a hill that had been a sacred site for 12,000 years. He had no idea. The people who built it had no idea what would come after them either. They just believed something was worth building for.